So the first one is a case that came out. I think the judgment was on the 4th of October. Rayclough, and forgive my pronunciation, but Beleghings, if I'm not mistaken, versus Bonkolo and 70 others. So this is a Joburg case. Yeah, sure. So this was quite an interesting one. I don't know. Do you want to start? Do you want to start, Nick?
Yeah. So let's just set up sort of the premise. So it's an eviction application. It's going through the High Court, Johannesburg. What was interesting about this particular case, it's obviously an eviction dealing with, I mean, at least 70 people. So it's a fairly large eviction. We're talking about a camp situation where people are living really bare bones here. But what was of real importance and a point of this particular case was the people that were living on this particular property were also functioning or running a business from this particular property, in the sense that they were, you guys would have seen them if you live in Joburg, they were recyclers. So those guys that are on the side of the road, riding trolleys, picking up stuff and taking them to recycling plants, that is how the people on this particular property derived their income and derived a livelihood for themselves.
Yeah, and I suppose that's the whole, it's almost like the reason that PI exists. So if you look at our eviction legislation, I mean, it's people that would be rendered homeless, people that are trying to make a living, so honest, decent people. But yeah, it's not necessarily all legal, living in the right place. They are, yeah, I mean, they're just trying to survive.
Yeah, and so a big part of this particular case was, you know, the factor that these people were using the property to derive a livelihood for themselves. And a big part of the, you know, opposition to the eviction in the circumstances was that if they were evicted from the premises, they may be relocated somewhere where they could no longer continue their livelihood in the circumstances. And so this is a big factor which was brought in by the particular tenants. We wanted to have a look at it because ultimately what the court held was that the eviction could go through, but it actually added a couple of conditions which were attached to the eviction order, which do interest us as property attorneys.
Absolutely. And I mean, I saw some articles being written on this court case, and it's crazy how divisive it is. And I suppose for us as attorneys, you know, it's very important, whereas maybe for the layperson on the street, it doesn't necessarily impact them all that much. But I mean, the scathing remarks by some legal practitioners versus the supportive remarks by certain organizations. And I mean, I suppose it just came down to economical right. If a person is to be removed from a property because he's not lawfully there, can they actually have an expectation to be put on a property where they can also exercise their economical rights as opposed to just residential rights? And here where I'm going to challenge you to the comparison is, we're speaking about economical rights, but a few weeks ago, we also spoke about a court case where the residents or occupiers aren't allowed to choose for simply things like convenience or preference. Yeah, they're not actually allowed to choose whether they prefer the alternative accommodation or not. So it's very interesting, like how do you kind of balance what's you know, something out of preference versus like a dire need that's economical rights? Because I mean, that line can get very blurry.
Yeah, and look, part of the thing I think that you and I deal with, you know, every day is in as much as, you know, there's a process for evictions to occur, there's always going to be a blurry line at the end. And it's part of the reason that PI, you know, sort of says you've got to take into consideration all relevant factors. You know, and it seems that you know, what the court is doing in this particular case, because even though they've ordered the eviction and they've you know, in this particular case, there was municipal engagement where the municipality had alternative land which people could be relocated to. The court even went a step further to try and sort of place a condition on the municipality to ensure that there would be some level of economic activity for these people, or the ability to continue their economic activity on this property, which is fascinating for us. You know, again, when it comes to evictions, and this is the reason, you know, people can't go through evictions through the tribunal. Tribunal's got no jurisdiction to do it. It's got to go through a court. It's got to have judicial oversight.
Sure.
And these are the reasons that judicial oversight is necessary in the circumstances, to try and take into account these relevant factors and make sure that, you know, even though you're doing an eject and people are being moved to another piece of property, are there other factors that have to be taken into account to ensure that a just and equitable order is ultimately given for these people?
Absolutely. And where I have to be critical of some of the scathing articles. So I think there's basically an opinion on every side to this, because on the scathing articles, I have to be critical. It was almost fear mongering to the point where now the owner needs to bear this brunt. The court never said the owner needs to bear this brunt. The court actually granted the eviction order. It just did so with an order against the municipality that they would have to provide particular alternative accommodation. So for the people, you know, trying to scare landowners, not so much, not on the way that the judgment, the ultimate effect of the judgment may be a different story, but the reality is the judge wasn't trying to place this burden on owners. The problem I see is the municipality's capacity is already capped. Their capacity to actually provide alternative accommodation is almost non-existent. To now add extra conditions does create a bit of a disconnect between, you know, the economic realities of, you know, what we're capable of. It's like, you know, telling the government to stop crime. It's, you know, how do you just make an order of court saying stop? It's you know, effectively, is it actually possible? And obviously the concern is the municipality is now going to run around for these 70 respondents, going to comply potentially, but what about the next 70 and the next 70 and the next 70? So it does come with its own problems, I have to admit, and I don't entirely agree, honestly, that PI was intended to protect economic rights, but it is a debatable matter. And I mean, then again, you also mentioned zoning and stuff like that, and whether that's also taken into account.
Yeah, look, I didn't want to touch on, you know, legalities and bylaws. You know, we don't really know what the situation is there. But I think I'm with you. The takeaway for me, you know, the court is again upholding, you know, the rights of the landowner, making sure that they can get back their property. That's fantastic. Again, you know, we've got a strong precedent there for our landowners. But then again, as you say, the factors that come in now when the eviction occurs, you know, that's interesting for us. And unfortunately, I am inclined to agree with you. You know, ultimately, even though an order wasn't made against the landlord to do anything alternative accommodation or you know, providing an economic basis for these guys, there's still some level of the landlord's going to have to wait, you know, for the municipality to get the land in place, you know, and land that fits the conditions. So it does affect our landowner at the end of the day.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. All right. So that's just our weekly case update. Then we've got